Hello there, everyone. I'm Kevin Kelley. He's Paul Girard. We're retired paramedics, now EMS performance enhancers, and we're here to help you make money and stay out of trouble. How you doing, Paul?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So, EMS return on investment. How do we do it?
I love this topic. This is something kind of newish for us. As you know, for folks out there listening for the first time, we've been doing EMS quality improvement for 17 years as Girard and Associates. We've been actually doing quality improvement even before that for agencies where we did the actual, we did the task, the day-to-day nuts and bolts of quality improvement. Over the course of the years, I've noticed that most agencies, the vast majority of agencies, look at their quality improvement programs and they consider them more of a cost, right? It's a cost center, something I've got to spend money on that doesn't provide a whole lot of return, certainly not financially, to the operation. And because of that, the number one problem that we see when clients call us or prospective clients call us is we just can't get the money. We have no money for quality improvement, but we want to improve our quality. And that's often coming from the chief quality officer as opposed to the chief of service type person. And so, when I talk to them about it and say, well, why is that? And they say, well, because every time I go to the administration and I say I want to bulk up on our quality improvement efforts, and they say, how much is it going to cost us? And they throw out a number, and they say, well, we don't have that kind of money laying around. Sorry about your problem. And so over the years, informally, as I've talked to various chiefs of operations who've hired us that we start working with, inevitably we get to the point where we start discussing patient care quality issues that when I discuss the problem with the call, they ended up being calls that could have been billed for that were not.
Right.
And had the quality improvement program for their service put in the proper effort in the proper area, they could have generated sizable returns back on their quality improvement investment, which would have offset the cost of paying for enhanced QA services.
So, budgetary shortfalls, can't afford it, is an obstacle for them to, what I would say, right source their CQI problem. Having the right people doing the right things at the right time for the right return. So, is G&A able to assist with that in any way?
Absolutely. So let's talk about the tangible, and specifically the tangible as it relates to financial returns, because that's the crux of the problem. We don't fund quality improvement to the degree that it should be funded. Because we don't, we have no idea how good or bad our patient care is, and nobody seems to kind of want to know. So they don't put a lot of effort into that component. And it's partly because I think everybody up until now has felt that it's not quantifiable, that it's impossible to quantify a return on investment for quality improvement efforts. And just by virtue of the way we do QA for agencies, we've actually found a way to quantify that financially. Now, as a sidebar, we've created a calculator that people can use to go in and estimate potential returns for their own CQI efforts or the potential returns for outsourcing your CQI to an agency such as ours. And that can be found on our website, which is www.girardassociates.com. There's also a blog about this topic, and within the blog, there's also a link to the calculator, but the calculator is also standalone on the site. So if you're interested, you can go and check that out, and I just want to mention that before I forget to mention it at the end of this thing, because I think a lot of folks would find this very interesting. So getting back to the original question, how do you actually do it? What are areas that you can provide quantifiable numbers for a return? So let's talk about one of those right now. So one of the main categories that we've determined that we can actually help agencies recoup some money that is otherwise lost is in the patient refusal category. So what happens is most agencies, they go about their business, they do their calls. I think most agencies and agency management and QA folks understand that a refusal is a high-risk proposition, and they, run classes all the time, how to execute a proper refusal, how to document a proper refusal. They bring in lawyers. They've been through multiple classes and trainings, and then they can't understand why folks are still writing inappropriate patient refusals or letting people refuse who shouldn't be refusing in the first place. So what we've noticed is when we get involved, we spend a lot of time on that particular topic with individual providers in the feedback loop, and we invariably help agencies decrease the numbers of refusals. That decrease in the numbers of refusals translates into billable transports. So, for example, crew shows up, they arrive on scene, the guy's, patient's highly intoxicated, stumbling around, but because they're A&O times 4 and they're answering 4 basic questions, the provider says, well, he's alert and oriented, so he has the right to refuse. He doesn't want to go. So they get a refusal and they leave, even though the guy's, stoned, right? He's clearly inebriated and is slurring speech and stumbling around sometimes pretty drastic stuff. Right. And yet people still affect that refusal. That should be a transport, right? In most states' protocols, certainly most protocols we are familiar with, patients who are inebriated or outright intoxicated are not allowed to refuse transport, right? You take them against their will, really, to some degree, but certainly you use every effort to convince them and maybe get PD involved, maybe get online medical control involved. There's a whole series of steps that you need to do to try to affect that transport. And there's a long laundry list of those types of calls, underage people signing refusals. I had a call where a two-year-old kid had a seizure, and the daycare provider, who was actually a 16-year-old kid, actually a babysitter, not daycare provider, but a babysitter who was watching the kid, called 911, and the crew showed up. They couldn't get in touch with the parents, and the kid wasn't seizing anymore, and the babysitter said, oh, he's fine. I guess he doesn't need to go to the hospital, and they got the babysitter to sign a refusal for a 2-year-old kid who had a seizure.
Right.
So there's all sorts of problems there, right? But yeah. Because the kid seemed like he was fine and wasn't seizing and seemed like he was acting age appropriately and all those types of things, and the kid said, yeah, I'll sit here with him and watch him, and if anything happens, I'll call you back. So that should be a transport. So we inevitably, for pretty much every agency we work with, we're able to decrease the number of inappropriate patient refusals, turn those into billable calls, and when you quantify that number times the base rate of the service, the numbers can be significant. So, for example, one agency that we started with, when we started with them, had a 28% patient refusal rate. After 4 years of working with them and lots of education and lots of feedback, putting it through the whole QI process, improvement process program, we were able to get their refusal rates down to 21% pretty consistently. The difference between 21% and 28% patient care refusals turned out to be 344 calls per year. Average base rate alone, no mileage, average base rate reimbursement for that agency is $500 a call. So $500 a call times 344 transports that would have been refusals is $172,000. That's more than 3 times what it costs to hire us to run their whole QA program. Right. And that's just the patient refusals category. So, and there are other opportunities as well, other examples of areas where if you spend some effort, you can affect change that will improve the bottom line of the organization. And if the organization is wise, they'll use that money to invest in their quality improvement.
And that's the tangible stuff. That's the money. Identifying monetary leakage, revenue protection, revenue integrity, whatever you want to call it. But there's also intangible aspects that often get forgotten in some of these, what I would call light on the CQI type systems. They just don't have the resources to even maintain compliance with the state regulation. There are a ton of intangibles. Can you talk about some of those too?
Yeah, so the biggest intangible is patient care, right? So how can you say you're a high-quality patient care organization when you really have no legitimate, measurable way to make that claim? And again, traditionally in EMS, we don't have a lot of standards to hold to. So you might look at cardiac arrest survival rates, but takes a lot of effort to improve those cardiac arrest survival rates.
Right.
You might say STEMI recognition rates. We're going to try to, look at STEMI recognition rates. But the problem with these is that oftentimes agencies are using the reports and the data off of their EPCR programs to say whether they're doing a good job or not. And the reality is that data is highly corrupt. That data is put in by the providers themselves, and the reports that are generated off of the EPCR programs have no way of knowing what it doesn't know. So, for example, if a provider missed a STEMI and they didn't even identify it as a potential STEMI, didn't even do a 12 lead on the patient because they didn't think that the old lady with nausea could potentially be a STEMI, and just didn't do anything about it, that call gets listed as an old lady with nausea, and that's it. So when they generate their STEMI report, show me how many STEMIs we did, it's missing all the ones that were missed. So if you're using that data to begin your QA process, right? Oh, we have a problem with STEMIs because our STEMI recognition is low. You're actually looking at faulty data. You really don't know how bad the problem really is.
How about paramedics triaging ALS calls to a BLS unit to free them up for another?
So here's
is
another
there an
great
opportunity there?
Yeah. There's two opportunities with that. One is the opportunity to improve patient care, because if a patient needed ALS and didn't get it, clearly that's problematic from a patient care and patient outcome potentially standpoint, but also from a litigation standpoint, for a reputational risk standpoint. There's all sorts of downstream bad problems with ALS providers triaging a call to BLS that should not be triaged to BLS. That also happens to be another measurable area for potential revenue recapture. So we see, again, with every agency we do, this happens all the time, just like with the refusals. No matter how diligent you think you're being in your program, there's still leakage on these categories, and it takes a certain type of QA activity in order to correct that problem to a large degree. For the triage to BLS issue, we notice that there's a variety of calls where patients tend to get triaged from the ALS providers, and it boils down to one of two main problems. Main problem number one is the paramedic didn't realize the potential severity of what could possibly be going on with this patient. They weren't looking at differentials, right? Other things that could be possibly the cause of this patient's condition. And so they inappropriately, again, let's go to that 80-year-old lady with some nausea. I've had it for 3 days. And the paramedic says, oh, okay, it's been ongoing for several days. It's just a little nausea. She says she gets this whenever she eats seafood, and she had seafood a day or two ago, and they build a story for the patient. Instead of saying, hey, I wonder if this is an atypical STEMI presentation, and maybe I should do a 12 lead on her. And, based on that, along with a more extensive history, she's at risk for a variety of conditions for which I probably shouldn't triage this patient back to the BLS folk. And so that's category one. Category two is just outright laziness. Right? There's, unfortunately, in our profession, Kevin, there are some folks who are not very thorough in doing their job, and it's partly because they just don't want to put the extra effort in. And we've had employees who've worked for us who fit that category. And so if a paramedic not me, right? Not me. Other people. But
other employers.
There are folks out there, other employers, yeah.
Right.
Never for my service, right?
That's
Nobody
correct.
Never work for my service. But the reality is they're out there. Every agency's got a couple of those folks, if not more. And so if they're either by error in clinical judgment, or the fact that they just want to turf the call to the BLS guy because they don't feel like ALSing this because that patient isn't serious enough. The arm is not lopped off, so you don't need ALS, so you can go BLS. And that's just wrong thinking. Yeah. Again, pretty much every agency we start with has that problem to some degree, even if it's unintentional, with providers just not recognizing certain calls that are on the bubble that probably should be ALS'd. Now, this is not just Paul saying they should be ALS'd. In our system, if you have that elderly lady with vague symptoms of nausea or not feeling well or whatnot, and you sent that down to the BLS level, in our system, that gets scored likely as a Category 3 or a Category 4 call, a medium or a high probability of an adverse patient outcome. And by definition, those calls automatically get a medical director review. So the auditor reviews it, says, yeah, this could be a whole bunch of other potential problems, just STEMI being one possible cause, but there's a laundry list of potential serious issues that could be going on with this patient that weren't fully assessed for and addressed. Probably shouldn't have downgraded it. Let's send it to the medical director and get his or her opinion. So because it meets that 3 or 4 level category criteria. So they forward it, and in the vast majority of cases, the medical director will review the totality of that call and say, yeah, you should have done some basic ALS for this person, or at least done a 12 lead before you kicked them to the BLS folks, or something. So those, when I say that there's a number of calls that we can convert, those are not just Paul saying you should ALS it, or the QA system saying you should. It's the medical director ultimately who've looked at those calls and said those should have been at the ALS level. So the data that we're using to promote this topic in this podcast is our experience after it's gone to the services medical director, not our medical director. It goes to the services medical director, and the service medical director said, yeah, you shouldn't have done that. So again, we see for that category, we see anywhere from a 5 to 30% error rate in calls that get triaged down to the BLS provider. So even if you use the 5%, and that turns out to be whatever, 1,000 calls a year, 500 calls a year, 100 calls a year, times the difference between the BLS base rate and the ALS base rate, it turns into tens of thousands of dollars again. And add that to the refusal problem, and you've got more than enough money to properly fund your QA initiatives.
Yeah, I'm thinking that there may be an opportunity to interact with insurance companies and talk about what G&A does and how G&A improves quality, reduce risk, reduce liability. Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, we have a little bit. We've a few years back, one of the agencies we contracted with, they called their insurance carrier and they said, we're talking about their liability insurance, right? Not,
That's
healthcare
correct.
insurance. And they said, we're hiring a third-party QA company. They provide all sorts of metrics and reports, including an overall score assessment of our overall care. Would you be willing to give us a break on our insurance premiums based on us doing this? And it was actually Blue Cross up here in the Northeast. And they said, yeah, absolutely, we'll give you. And I think it was 10 or 15% off of their liability premiums that they got for having an outside third-party QA company not only reviewing all their work, but providing data back to the chief, who then submitted it back to the insurance company every trimester. When we produced the management reports, the chief was required to send those reports to the insurer to show that the job was getting done, but also the improvement as well as the risk areas that were being worked on. And the insurer actually liked it. They thought it was a pretty cool concept. So I think it is worth a call to your insurer if you're going to, especially if you're going to have if you're going to outsource the QA. If you do it in-house, there's a little bit of concern that there may be bias internally and that sort of thing. So the insurers generally are, okay, that's great, you should be doing it, but they're not too interested. But when they hear that it's a third party coming in and doing the review, and that we have a really significant analysis of every single call, right? Every single call gets reviewed and scored, and opportunities for improvement are presented on the vast majority of those calls, even if it's not a critical failure. So they really like that thought that we're preventing things from happening and being preemptive, but also measuring where our weak areas are and then doing things to shore up those weak areas. And then we show them the results of that trimester over trimester in terms of whether we're making progress. So they liked it to the degree that they were willing to give a bit of a break on insurance premiums for that particular agency. And they were a small agency, and they still saved a few $1,000s a year, I think it was, on their liability insurance. So if you're a bigger agency, it could be big money.
QA has been around, CQI, QI, whatever you want to call it, has been around for a very long time. It's been talked about in EMS. I started in 1986. You started before that. It doesn't appear to me that the ball has moved very far in EMS CQI, with the exception of the G&A way. Why hasn't the ball moved? Why haven't EMS agencies and some very well known considered high-performing EMS agent. How come EMS as a whole hasn't moved the ball very much in CQI? How come we're making the same mistakes? How come we're triaging to BLS the same patients? How come we're allowing patients to continue to refuse treatment and transport when we shouldn't be? Why are we doing that?
Oh boy, there are so many variables wrapped up in that. It's a great question. And like many complicated problems, the answer is multifaceted.
So let me why has GNA been so successful? We started out as a Massachusetts company. We became a regional company, and now we are slowly becoming a national company. Why has GNA been successful at improving patient care when others have not?
The short answer is because we do it differently
How
from
do you do
everybody
it?
else. Well, we do everything ass backwards. So, I think the intuitive part of quality improvement, right? So you're a chief of service or an administrator, and you say, okay, we're going to do this quality stuff. It sounds simple to me. I'll have Bob in the basement, who's a paramedic, run reports, and if guys screw things up, Bob will go talk to people and tell them not to do that sort of stuff. It sounds relatively simple.
We're going to pick on Bob.
Right? We're going to pick on Bob, right?
I remember Bob.
This imaginary
I remember
Bob.
We had a couple of Bobs.
Yeah. We had a bunch of Bobs. We had more Bobs than we can recall. Now, unfortunately, all the good Bobs are saying, hey, man, you're maligning me.
The Bob-phobic.
So this does not count the good Bobs. These are the bad Bobs we're talking about. Bobophobes, right? I think that when you look at it intellectually, I think a lot of people say, okay, this is pretty easy stuff. Just read reports, and if they screw something up, go tell them to cut it out, right? So go fix it. But it's actually, that's not how you should start your QA process, right? So let's quote Steve Covey. You and I are Covey fans, right, from way back.
Yep,
you remember Covey, right? 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and all sorts of other stuff. And one of Covey's tenets in the 7 Habits is start with the end in mind. So when we created this QA process, we started backwards. We didn't start with what should we do to do QA. We started with what are we trying to accomplish through the QA process? Where are we trying to go with this? And what we were trying to do is create a better mousetrap for quality improvement where the emphasis was on the patient, reducing risk to the patient and hopefully improving outcomes, and doing it in an atmosphere where providers don't have to feel fearful or intimidated by the process. In other words, an education-based QA model as opposed to a critical QA model. So, in fact, most of our auditors that we hire, I don't look for people with QA experience because most people do QA and EMS unintentionally, don't do it properly, don't do it well. We hire educators primarily. We're looking for people with education backgrounds because when they audit the call, they're looking for, they speak in their comments in terms of, if that were a student of mine, what would I say to them that would educate them to doing the job a little better? So I prefer educators to be QA folks as opposed to QA folks to be QA
So you're coaching
folks.
them up.
Coaching them up. Yeah, coach, teach, mentor, right?
Right,
You should be there to serve. If your job should be, I'm there to serve the EMTs and paramedics to help them be the best version of themselves that they can be. That's my job, is to help them. My job is not to find their errors and go criticize them for it. My job is not to find their errors so I can report them to administration or the medical director. My job is to find areas for improvement, not errors, areas for improvement where they did a good job, but it could be a little better had they just done one more little thing in there. And then have the conversation with the provider about the pros and cons of that statement. So if you go back to the ALS-BLS thing, paramedic decides to BLS that patient who's a little old lady with a little bit of nausea for a couple of days or not feeling well for a couple of days. They did a half-baked assessment that implies that she looks pretty solid clinically. Her vitals are good. Maybe they threw her on the monitor and it was sinus and, there was nothing significant. So the patient passed the eyeball test, right? She looks okay to me. So the auditor would review that and say, yeah, I'm not really comfortable because there's all sorts of differentials that could be going on here that weren't thoroughly assessed for, right? They didn't do a complete assessment, and there's stuff missing that might indicate there's something else going on with this patient. I'd recommend they put a line and do a 12 lead and do a basic ALS workup on this patient. It goes to the coordinator. The coordinator meets with the provider, and we go through the detail, the merits of that comment. So we're not saying that they should have necessarily. We're saying let's ask intellectually, let's ask the question and debate the merits of that statement that this patient perhaps should have had ALS. And so when we talk with the provider, it's not you should have ALS the patient. It's like, okay, here's one person's opinion. Perhaps you should have ALS them. Let's look at the run report and let's debate. And then you sit and talk about here's all the pros for why you should have ALS them. Here's all the cons why you didn't need to ALS them. Which outweighs which? Is there a higher propensity for an adverse patient outcome because some of the things that you didn't do? Or is it all, superfluous stuff that wouldn't have impacted the patient either way and therefore is not necessary, and you're not, by the way, violating any protocols or any of your training or any of the standards that, you're held to? So we really are looking for the opportunity to discuss and talk with providers about every call they do, every single call. That's where one of the ways in which we're very different, because most quality improvement programs, because they're underfunded or because the QA folks think their job is different, the old school, I just read run reports and go back and talk to people if there's a problem, then they're missing all these opportunities to have really good conversations with providers to understand how they think about topics and be able to probe and understand where their weak spots are in either their experience level, their education level, or their workload level, their motivation level.
So when we were talking about the municipal liability insurance reduction potential, you mentioned that the insurance company was intrigued by the unbiased nature of this CQI process. Can you expand on that? What is biasness in the CQI process, and how does the GNA way mitigate that?
Yeah, okay. So, bias is a natural thing. We've all got it. Everybody's got it. So when you work for an agency and you get promoted from staff paramedic or staff EMT to quality improvement coordinator, you bring along with it all of your experience, which includes all of your potential biases. So, if you worked with those folks and you know that Bob is an excellent medic, you review his run report that has a couple of things that raise a couple of questions, but you go, no, Bob's an excellent medic. I'm sure there's no issue here. And you dismiss it without going and talking to Bob and inquiring about those issues. Bob could have had a bad day. Bob could have missed that day of paramedic school, even though he attended all the other days and did really well. There's all sorts of things that could have happened. So you really need to go and have the discussion and not inflict that bias. The other bias as a coordinator is you read the run report and you say, yeah, Bob didn't ALS that patient. I wouldn't have either, because most of those patients turn out to get discharged before we get done writing the run report and going home anyway. So I don't see the need for ALS. But your medical director might not agree with that, and the protocol might not agree with that. So really you're inflicting your opinion on that call when really you should be objective and say, could somebody read this and think that Bob should have acted a different way? And if so, let's explore that. Let's go talk to Bob. Let's go feed it to the medical director, see what he thinks, get his opinion first before we go, and then go talk to Bob, and then discuss the pros and cons and get more background information on the call. Discuss the merits of handling it the way it was handled versus handling it in other ways. Therefore you can get rid of a lot of that bias activity by having multiple. In GNA, we have multiple folks who read the report.
Right.
It's not just, we have one auditor who's trained to have a very low threshold. Yeah. If anybody could suggest that you should have zigged when you zagged, flag it for that. Let the QA process figure out whether they should have zigged when they zagged, and that sort of thing, as opposed to them rendering their opinions.
So Bob is generally an asshole, or thought of to be an asshole, but he's a pretty decent paramedic. And it's time for Bob to go. Nobody likes Bob. He's not a team player, but he toes the line. What it sounds like is that at times the QA process could be biased and weaponized against Bob for reasons that have nothing to do with patient care quality. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of the problem. And that's actually a big part of the problem. The reason people resent QA processes is because they at least perceive that that's going on,
Yeah.
right? Perceived inequities in the process. You
He's
know,
picking on me.
You're busting Bob's balls, but,
Yeah.
Paul does it all the time. You never say anything to
Right.
him,
Yep.
And that sort of thing. So, the system has to be judicious and fair all around. If you're going to question that for a paramedic that you don't have a lot of respect for and say, hey, perhaps you should have ALS that patient, you should have the same conversation with Bob, right? The question is the question, not I'm sure this paramedic, because he's so good, would have ALS him if he needed it. Yeah, that's not QA. That's just you cutting slack to the provider based on the information that you have about that provider overall as their caregiver, but you don't know if they were having a bad day that day or they just didn't pick up on something that you picked up on. You really can't. The only way to know that is to read the reports thoroughly, ask the questions on every call that need to be asked, go back and discuss those cases with each provider, even on the calls that are not serious, even the small stuff. And that takes a lot of manual labor legwork. Manual labor legwork costs money. But you know what fixes problems? It's that manual labor legwork. To go back to your original statement, you're a provider who's been in the field for a number of years. You went through EMT training and they taught you how to do a patient refusal and how to document a patient refusal. You went through paramedic training and you went through classes on how to do that. You took refreshers programs where they talked about how to do that. You've been to M&M rounds where your medical director has told you what he would like you to see or she would like to see you do in relation to executing patient refusals. You've had management put forth policies and procedures on doing patient refusals, and we still have a patient refusal problem. So we put in all this effort. The provider's been around forever. They've heard this message over and over again. When you talk to the provider, he can quote you all the things he should do about a patient refusal in terms of how to properly execute it. So where's the problem? And the problem, just like every other problem in patient care and EMS, is that you're not giving that individual provider customized information for what he or she is doing wrong before it becomes a major problem. So you wait until something bad happens, then you go back and say, here's a refusal you did where there were problems, and the provider says, I've been executing my refusals that way for 15 years. Nobody's ever said anything to me. So until you can sit with each provider, and we do it on a trimester basis, every 4 months, for the category 3 and 4 calls, those are the more urgent questions, right? The things that might be more problematic.
And what would those be?
We do those immediately.
What's that? What's a 4?
Okay, a 4 would be a patient who's you show up, patient's in cardiac arrest, you mess around with airways and IVs, you put him on the monitor 4 minutes later, you see that he's in VFib, and it takes you 3 minutes to defibrillate that patient. So from the time of patient contact to the time of defib for a patient in VFib is 7 minutes, right? So 7 minutes to defibrillation. Right. There's a high probability that patient is going to have an adverse outcome because of that lack of action. You have a STEMI patient, pale, diaphoretic, clutching their chest. Everything tells you he's having a STEMI. You do a 12 lead, he's got a STEMI, and it took you 22 minutes to give him aspirin. Okay.
That's a 4.
Maybe that's a bit long, right? So maybe that aspirin could be given sooner, which potentially would minimize the level of infarction that the patient may have, and infarction is heart muscle damage, right? So that patient may have had more heart muscle damage as a result of the delay in the aspirin. Now, as I mentioned to you, the auditors are going to score things at the level that somebody could come back and say there's a problem here. So they might make that a 4, and we send it to the medical director. And we send these calls to medical directors, and some medical directors will say, I haven't read any science that's saying 22 minutes to aspirin is more problematic than 4 minutes to aspirin. They gave the aspirin. I don't see the problem here. At some point in the call, they gave aspirin, and they'll downgrade that call. Right. Now, I disagree with that from a philosophical, intellectual level, but he's the medical director, or she's the medical director. So if she wants to downgrade it, the QA process did its job. It identified a potential problem. It forwarded it to the right person. The medical director outranks everybody in terms of clinical care for that agency. So if she says it's okay, it's okay. But most medical directors will say, yeah, no, I'd prefer you give that aspirin sooner, right? 22 minutes seems a little long to me, right? Without any justification in the report, right? There's no, the patient didn't want to take it and we had to convince them, there's no mitigating circumstances.
And it's a violation of the statewide treatment protocol.
And it's a violation of, interesting, the statewide treatment protocol doesn't give you a time in most cases, and we deal with a lot of different protocols, right? So some people their protocol might, others will not, but some will agree with me, some will disagree with me. But a lot of protocols don't give you a time parameter for time to aspirin, from patient contact to time for aspirin. So because it doesn't say, people are like, well, when I give it, right? So where's the standard? Well, the standard at that point is whatever the medical director says it is, right? So when we flag that call, send it to the medical director, we're not only asking him to weigh in on whether 22 minutes is too long to aspirin. We want to know what is too long. What would you like the paramedics to, or EMTs, right? Because EMTs can give aspirin. What would you like the field providers to do from time of contact and identification of a patient having a potential ACS event to them getting the aspirin? What would you like to see? And so medical directors begin to develop internal policies on these types of questions that nobody's ever asked before, that we're now asking. And in a lot of cases, those have led to changes in protocol, right? Medical directors have gone back and said, hey, the protocol doesn't address this. A number of years ago, we had a protocol here locally where if a patient was hypoglycemic with a blood sugar under 70, they got a full amp of D50. And this is quite a few years ago now. But
it was the old altered
so our
mental
auditors would
status
flag it.
protocol. We were loading everybody up with thiamine, Narcan, and D50 no matter what. Just because.
Well, even after the.
Yeah, I mean, you know, right?
ahead.
I mean, they altered mental status. We didn't have the protocol development, I guess, back then. And so we were loading everybody up with thiamine, Narcan, and D50 based on altered mental status because that's what the protocol says.
Correct. And so what happened is we bring him to the hospital. They do a blood sugar on him. It was 350. You know, and it was really high. And what good are we doing the patient if we're jacking them up that high? So the auditors, by protocol, had to score that a 3 or a 4 because the paramedic. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. So if the paramedic shows up and the patient's got a blood sugar of 69, by protocol they give an amp of D50, and so. The auditors were reading that and saying, this doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense from a patient care standpoint, even though they're following protocol. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to score it a 3, medium probability of adverse outcome, because jacking up blood sugars for these diabetics is not a good thing for them, certainly not in the long term if you keep doing it over and over again. And send it to the medical director because I want him or her to weigh in on this topic. So they played devil's advocate, and we're sending these calls to the medical director. Say this is a 3 or a 4 because, you know, even though they followed protocol, they did something that doesn't seem to be prudent from a patient care standpoint. And so medical directors are saying, yeah, this doesn't make any sense to me. We shouldn't be gigging providers for doing stuff that is good medicine, even though it might not be protocol. What would happen is, let me clarify that statement, right? What was happening is paramedics were on their own deciding to give partial amps of D50 for that patient with a blood sugar of 69, who's a diabetic with a slight altered mental status, that sort of thing. And they would give a half an amp because they didn't want to jack them up. They were doing good, prudent paramedicine, but that was the violation of protocol, not giving the full amp. And so the auditors felt bad about saying, I'm going to gig you for not giving the full amp. On the other hand, it's a violation of protocol to not give the full amp. So they would send it to medical direction. The medical directors finally got together and said, this is bullshit. And they went back to medical services, to the OEMS, and said, we got to change this protocol because, you know, we're jacking up people's blood sugars all over the place.
So a couple of important points. Number one is that Girard and Associates, though wears many hats, is a delegatee of the medical director. Is that right? I mean, we are a delegated responsibility of the medical director by virtue of the medical director's responsibility to review run reports. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think on some level that's a true statement. I'm always hesitant to say that the quality improvement folks are a direct arm of the medical director. And the reason I'm a little hesitant, not that we don't enforce everything medical directors say to, right? They are the boss from a purely regulatory standpoint and even a logic standpoint, right? They're the physician, you know, we're paramedics. So, you know, yeah, they need to make those decisions. But I think if they think of you solely as a tool of the medical director, if they have a problem with their medical director for some reason or another, then you become part of that problem. So what we say to folks is, we're here to make sure we interact between you and the medical director. And if you have a good case, we're going to help you build that case for the medical director, right? So we're not just going to say, well, the medical director said you should do it, so you need to do it. If the provider gives you good feedback on why they were thinking the way they were thinking, as coordinator, you're obligated, you should be obligated to go back to the medical director and say, hey, Mr. Medical Director, you faulted them for whatever and these issues, and you said you wanted this done this way. But the paramedic builds a pretty good case based on how he was trained or she was trained, and based on the protocol language being consistent with what they did, and try to present that in a way to create dialogue between medical direction, QA, and the provider to determine what really is in the patient. And believe it or not, in a lot of cases, the medical directors say, yeah, you know what, I get what you're saying with that. I get it. I don't, really, I probably shouldn't have scored it the way I had. That actually makes some sense. So, that takes the pressure off a little when the provider feels like you're going to defend them, and help them to craft a good answer back to the medical director that doesn't make them sound like an idiot.
Yeah, as part of the EMS provider enhancement wing. I mean, we're here to advocate and assist the EMS provider getting to the next level.
Right. That's true. So again, it's a holistic view to doing quality improvement. And getting back to the ROI thing, in order to get the results that we're talking about in terms of those revenue enhancements, what some chiefs will say is they'll listen to this discussion and they'll say, okay, so what I need to do is pay attention to refusals and triages. I'm going to have my guys review just those calls, right? Spend all your time on those two topics to get us the revenue, but I'm not going to give you any more resources because I already got you. So just go fix that problem. We'll get all the revenue. And it doesn't work that way, because in order for that coordinator to do that job, they need to be thorough to the point of giving customized information back to each provider on their practice, how that provider practices their care, certainly in relation to those two topics, but all their care, quite frankly, and give them that feedback. And even if you've only got 15 people, that's a lot of feedback, right? So, we've created a system where we can streamline that process, and we do it in a very efficient manner. But it's still fairly labor intensive. If you don't have all the streamlined things that we have, all the tools in place, it takes 3 times as long to do it. And that's a lot of money. You need a lot of people to do that, which makes it, I don't want to say cost prohibitive, because you still might, even if you had to hire an additional person or two to do that, using the excess money that process would get for you, you probably still break even or benefiting financially, even with hiring those additional people, but you get the results and do the job properly, as opposed to the spotty, we just pull random calls and do sampling, and we're going to fix this refusal problem by just doing sampling 10% of our total call volume. You're not providing enough data back to the providers to get them to change their behaviors.
If people want to learn more about how to make money, stay out of trouble, want to connect with Girard and Associates, how do they do that?
So as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, they can go to our website, because we have a blog that kind of talks about this in a little bit of depth, and that might help explain things. And there are some other examples of opportunities in there, including, ALS-1 calls that should be ALS-2 calls, because providers were nudgy about doing the skills, that will get you to an ALS-2 level, right? Like pacing patients who are conscious, cardioverting patients, drilling a patient with an IO who's still conscious, so they tend to shy away from doing those procedures, which is not only not great for the patient if they needed those procedures done, but it means you can't bill at that ALS-2 level. So that's another opportunity. So there are others. So go and check out the blog at girardassoc.com, and on our website, within the blog, there's a link to a calculator, an Excel calculator, that you can use to plug in your own numbers. And on our website, under the Resources tab, we have the standalone calculator that you can just go, if you don't want to read the blog stuff, you just want to go play with the calculator and plug in some of your numbers and see what it would likely do. The other piece of that is you need to know what your investment in the QA process is. So the other piece of the revenue side is, what resources do I need to put into my QA system? Whether you're doing that internally and you're trying to decide whether to hire another person to help you get to that level and what that would do financially, or you're considering outsourcing. And so, what's the cost of outsourcing versus the cost of those revenue numbers? And I would say if you're at least break even or positive, you now have a more robust QA process that's doing a better job, but you didn't have to invest any real, any dollars that you didn't previously have.
So give us a call. He's Paul Girard. I'm Kevin Kelley. This is the G&A Way podcast. Have a great day, everyone.